hi everyone. We might begin today. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Data Storytelling in Australian Schools with Dr. Selena Fisk. I'm Lauren Mitchell, an editor at Hawker Brownlow Education, which is based in Naarm, Melbourne. I'm joining you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Hawker Brownlow Education acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. For those who aren't familiar with Hawker Brownlow Education, we empower Foundation to 12 teachers and educational professionals with the tools, skills, and resources to help improve classroom performance and raise student achievement. Got a couple of tips for today's webinar before we begin. Please use your chat box for any technical questions and send them to the user named Hawker Brownlow Education. That's me. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them and get everything working just fine. You'll be placed on mute during the webinar, so please type in the chat box and ensure you choose all attendees and panelists. I do also know that there will be a short exercise in the middle of this of this webinar, so you'll be jumping into the chat box to work on that. There will also be a Q&A at the end, so please type these questions into the chat box as well. I will pose them to Selena once we come to the end of the webinar, so we'll get your questions answered, throw them in, I'll hold on to them, and you'll get them answered. If you do need to get in contact with us after today, you can reach us via email at info@hbe.com.au. You can also follow us at all the usual places on social media. You can find past webinars and other video resources just like this session on our YouTube channel at Hawker Brownlow Ed. Now, let me introduce you to Selena Fisk. Dr. Selena Fisk is a school data coach and consultant with 16 years teaching experience in secondary schools in Queensland and in the UK. She is passionate about data storytelling and using data in ways that help school communities, teachers, and students flourish. Selena has published 2 best-selling books with Hawker Brownlow Education, that's Using and Analysing Data in Australian Schools, the second edition of which was recently released this year, and Leading Data-Informed Change in Schools. I have just noticed there's a quick question in the chat box, and that is, will the session be recorded for viewing again later? Yes, it is. It is being recorded and it will be available to view in 7 to 14 days. So, Selena, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'll hand over to you now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lauren. Lauren didn't mention that she edited that second edition of my first book. So yeah, a big public thank you to you, Lauren. It's been really good to kind of see it come to life. And thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. We've got 103 people on. We had something like 460 people register. So there's a lot of people getting the recording for this session. So that's pretty exciting. I'm pretty excited that that many people wanted to talk about data and think and talk about data for the next hour or so. So yeah, absolutely gold. So as Lauren mentioned, I've got a teaching background and I finished teaching at the end of 2019. And for the last couple of years, I've been self-employed and I work as a data storyteller. So what that means is that I work with schools predominantly. I am starting to work outside the school space, but I'm still working quite heavily in schools. And I help schools and teachers work with the data that they've got to think about how they can use that to lead change and lead to action for the young people in their care. So when it comes to talking about data storytelling in Australian schools, I'm really lucky because I get to go into so many different schools all the time. Last week, I was in a school in regional New South Wales, and the week before I was in some schools in Darwin. The week before that, I was in regional Queensland. So it's really extraordinary for me to see the ways people are using data and responding to student data and how they're catering for kids' needs that little bit better. And I guess the last couple of years for me has really reaffirmed that there is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach that suits everybody. It's reaffirmed the fact that there are a lot of people who are trying to use data well, but don't necessarily know what that looks like. And yeah, I guess it's reinforced for me, and this is why I got into this work in the first place, that ultimately students are the people that benefit from any discussion or analysis of the data, and that's what we need to kind of keep front and center. And in some ways, it's kind of ironic that this conversation about data is happening in NAPLAN week. That was completely accidental, actually. But, NAPLAN, think about it what you will, the value in NAPLAN data is when it ultimately benefits little people and young adults. So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, getting to data storytelling. So for me, there's a few, really big umbrella terms and things that I like to talk about that really preface this conversation for me around using data and engaging in data storytelling. The first one is the really important need for us to be data informed and not data driven. And this applies to everybody in all schools. It doesn't matter what your role is within the school, but also the ability to talk about data and the use of data in that way. So I think about data driven, as like being, say, a horse with blinkers on. Horses are sometimes in a horse race, they wear blinkers, and the idea of the blinkers, so they kind of shield on either side of their eyes. And what it does is it's meant to shield them from the things, the noise, the stuff that's happening around them, so they don't get distracted and they can just focus on the finishing line. And I reckon when organizations are data driven, that's what they're doing. They're focusing on this end goal and they're not paying attention to the stuff that's happening around them. But we need to, in schools and in all organizations, we need to be data informed, and that's where those blinkers come off. And while we might be aspiring to achieve something, we might be looking to shift practice and look for improvements, we're doing that through the lens of also paying attention to the stuff that's going on around us. So for example, it's looking at the data and the numbers and like the quantitative information that we've got, but also using our understanding of the individual kids themselves, the teachers, the subject area, the teaching team, the school context, family, whatever it might be, but using all of that information together to help inform what those next steps might be and what the decisions might be that come from that analysis in the first place. The second thing I often talk about is the importance of celebrating and recognising progress and not just looking at achievement. So Australian teachers are really good at achievement measures. You know, we have to mark students against the curriculum. We have to report to parents, generally on a 5-point or an A to E scale. We do all of that really well. We give kids awards at the end of the year for the number of A's and, really good, excellent results. At the same time, though, there's, a growing focus in data in Australian schools, which is around the idea of progress and growth. And it started to creep into things like the National School Improvement Tool, and it's referred to, but people don't always know or always kind of talk about what that is and what it might look like. The difference between growth and achievement measures for me is that a growth measure needs to be the distance that a young person has travelled. So you actually need to have 2 or more data points in order to calculate that distance that they've travelled. So rather than just looking at a point in time, it might be NAPLAN scale score, it might be a PAT scale score, it might be a DRA level, it might be an A to E, it could be a GPA. Rather than looking at one bit of data by itself, it's looking at, well, how did they go last time they did this assessment, and how far have they moved from one to the next? And the reason why I really like looking at and celebrating progress is because not every student all the time is going to be able to achieve really high results and get up on awards nights and celebration assemblies and receive an achievement award. But everybody's got the capacity to make progress and to kind of make those small incremental changes and to nudge their progress forward, even if they're not at that highest end. So there's, I reckon there's a growing need for us to be talking about the way that we look at progress and we celebrate that. And it really does flip the conversation that we can have with teachers and with kids when we're focusing on their own growth rather than just how many students are getting those highest results. The third thing that really kind of stands out for me is that whenever we think about data and using data for storytelling, is that we must be triangulating the information that we've got. So we should never just be paying attention to one data set or one piece of data. It should always be, when we're using data for decision making, it should always be that we look at 3 or more sources. So the idea of triangulation is that we look at 3, it might be 4 if you want, maybe 5 if you're really pushing it. But We look for the data sets that are actually going to give us useful information that's going to help us, or help, I guess, inform the decisions that we're making. So if we have a particular area of inquiry, to say we might be looking at reading in year 5, we would think, okay, well, what 3 or 4 data sets are going to give me the best information about year 5 reading? So we can be really targeted and really specific, make sure that we've got all of those sets of information in front of us. And depending on your context, your data that you choose for triangulation might look really different to a different teacher or a different school or a different year level, and all of that's okay. It is about finding what works for you, but it's also about thinking, well, what's actually the most useful information and what's actually going to be helpful for me? One of the examples, so I work with a school in Victoria that's a flexible learning context. And for them, when they talk about literacy and numeracy data, because they have students that come from really complex backgrounds, they won't ever have a conversation about literacy or numeracy achievement without talking about each young person's attendance and their self-reported wellbeing scores at the same time. So they actually triangulate attendance, wellbeing, and learning results side by side, and they use that kind of collection of information to inform their decision making. So that's kind of what I mean about finding whatever is useful for you, what helps you with your area of inquiry, and what's best for your context. The final thing when we're thinking about data that I guess, as I said, that I always like to start these conversations with is the idea of thinking like a scientist. So you might have heard of or read Adam Grant's book that he released last year called Thinking, let's try that again, Think Again. And in that, he talks about we think in one of 4 ways. And what he talks about in that book is that he encourages us to think as often and as much as we can like scientists. And when he talks about thinking like a scientist, he says, we have a hypothesis and we can investigate the hypothesis, or we do investigate the hypothesis. We look for data that, supports the hypothesis. We also look for data that disproves the hypothesis. And ultimately, like scientists, we're really open to changing our perspective or changing our understanding as we go. So our mindset is not fixed. Our understanding or perceptions are not fixed. We're constantly thinking about, okay, what's some new information, and does that kind of change what I think or feel or see around this topic? So when it comes to using data in our schools, data is a really good way of catching kids out for the right reasons. There are times where you will have a young person really surprise you in a standardized assessment. They'll like smash it out of the park. They'll get really great results. And that bit of information should really change your perspective about what that young person needs. So it's not, whenever we look at standardized assessment or big data, it's not about holding the same perception of kids' achievement and potential indefinitely. It's about, every single one of those bits of information along is just a point in time, and our perspectives shift as we progress. So I just wanted to talk through, I guess, why we're at this point in Australia where we're talking about data so often, and why so many of you have showed up this afternoon and so many of you have registered. There's a number of different policy and framing documents in Australia that have influenced the position that we're in now. Before this, even before 2008, the PISA, TIMSS and PIRLS international comparisons were, I think, a key factor in the shift towards this conversation between, or the connection between, data and education. And the Australian positioning and standings started to drop over time. And I guess the way that Australia responded to that, or one of the first ways that they responded to that, was in the 2008 Melbourne Declaration, which many of you would be familiar with. From my perspective, the thing I find really interesting about that education declaration, so this is a declaration that's signed by every education minister in the country. It's the first declaration in Australia that mentioned data and evidence in the way that it does. So the previous education declaration from 10 years prior made no mention of data or evidence at all. Might have implicitly, but didn't actually use that language. So the Melbourne Declaration is a statement or an aspirational statement of Australian education, and it kind of outlined, I guess, the vision for Australian education over the coming kind of 10 years. So as a result, there was a lot of other, I guess, frameworks that were put around our work that have influenced us in this data space, all of which were in some way influenced by the Melbourne Declaration. So the Australian curriculum release, adjustments to state curriculums, there's been the Untitled Teacher standards, there's the principal standards. ASA has developed the National School Improvement Tool. There's also the Principal Improvement Tool, and there's whole education system improvement tools. There's also been a review of initial teacher education. So that came out in about 2015. In that review of initial teacher education in Australia, one of the findings was that graduates were often not profession ready, was the language that was used in the document. So as a result of that, teacher performance assessments have entered our landscape, and that's where pre-service teachers need to complete a very different assessment now that includes data as well as pass their final prac. And that's really different, a really different environment to, I know, what I graduated, or when I graduated from uni and when I studied. Most recently, there's been the Alice Springs Declaration. So that replaces the Melbourne Declaration. It's the updated version of that aspirational statement for Australian education. And again, kind of from my perspective, the thing I find really interesting about that is that the words data and evidence are used twice as often in the Alice Springs Declaration than they were in the Melbourne Declaration. So from my perspective, what has happened has been this kind of spiraling increase in expectations, and it's kind of, they're all just mounting on top of one another. And while I clearly am the data person, I love it, and I think there's a whole lot of value in the information that we can get, and it does help us understand our learners that bit better. There hasn't necessarily been the same level of skill support for educators to build their skill at the same rate as these expectations have been increasing. So that's the challenge, and that's the challenge that I often hear when I work with schools. I joke that I've never been invited into a school to help them find more data. It's usually that I go in and schools say, we have so much information and we're not necessarily using it as well as we could be, or in the ways that we should be. And we spend time working through that and unpacking that. So there is so much data that's available to us. We have so much information. We have more data in our schools than we've ever had before. But it is really important for us to get to that point of being able to actually use it and engage in the data storytelling, that we know what's important to us and what we value and where that data sits and how people use it and all that sort of thing. So it's pretty complex, as I say, spiraling kind of expectations, and we've got a pretty big job ahead to upskill staff and bring everybody along on this journey with us. So I'm just going to pause there for a sec. I've shared a fair bit about my own perspectives, that I bring to this conversation about data, and a little context as to kind of why we're at this point in Australian education, why we're talking about this. I'd love for you to drop into the chat, if you've got access to it at the moment. What are some of the challenges that you see? One of the things I've learned over the last couple of years is that there are so many consistent challenges across sites that I go into, and no matter what type of school, the size of the school, the context, whatever it might be. What are some of the challenges that you see? Just drop those into the chat for me. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah, that's great. Keep typing if you're still going. There's some great answers there, and also some really kind of consistent themes that you'll see emerging. What do we actually do with the data? Do teachers know necessarily how that can inform their practice and what that might look like? Validity and accuracy of the data, that's another one that I see and hear a fair bit of. Like teachers coming to me saying, I've got these PM or probe results, or I've got A to E results from last year, and yet what I'm seeing in the classroom now early in the year is actually not matching what the teacher gave them at the end of last year. And so there's kind of questions about validity and moderation and that sort of thing. There's a strong theme coming through around the amount of time that people have got access to, and I'm going to show you some data that I've collected on that. Yeah, and which data for what purpose, Veronica has said, and that's so true. And in the work that I've done, you know, I feel like with these increasing expectations, data sets have been added to schools, and they're just kind of added on top of each other over time, and they're almost like stacking on top of one another, and not, you know, schools haven't always had the chance to kind of zoom out and think, well, is this actually all serving us? Like, do we need to be doing all of the things that we're doing? So I was in a school recently that are using 4 different reading assessments in lower primary. And, you know, and I kind of said to them, I said, why are you using 4? And they kind of couldn't really, they could explain why they had been introduced, and different people wanted different things from them. And they kind of could explain that, but they couldn't tell me how one really gave them better information than the other, and they couldn't really justify all 4. So we actually removed some of them, which was liberating, I think. So yeah, staff understanding the data is absolutely, and how to engage in meaningful conversation is a hard one. You know, being able to actually know how to talk data. So setting up the structures, you know, some schools and some leaders that I work with kind of say, well, you know, we want our teachers to talk about data in staff meetings or in department meetings or year level team meetings. And to be completely blunt, there's plenty of people who don't know what that looks like, and they don't know how to do it. I was working with a primary school 2 weeks ago, and a teacher said to me, she said, Selena, I keep being told to use data to inform my practice, and I have no idea what that actually means. So there is certainly work to be done around building the vocabulary, the language, the ability to talk with others about data, so they can start to engage in those conversations with their colleagues. That's awesome. Thank you so much for everybody who has contributed. There's a lot of familiar names in there. Great to see you again. So in the work that I've done over the last couple of years, you know, there's 3 big things that stand out for me. So when we talk about using data effectively, there's 3 big kind of ticket items, and that's these 3. So if we want people to be using data to inform their practice, we first need to be thinking about data literacy. So data literacy is the understanding of the numbers and the context and what those things mean. So Charles Seif wrote a book called Proofiness, You're Being Fooled by the Numbers. And there's a really great quote in there, and he says, nobody cares about the number 5. And he basically says something along the lines of, it's not until you put the context around the 5 that it actually means anything to anybody. So if I have 5 dogs, or if I ate 5 tacos, or I won $5 million, all of those things mean something completely different. All would be good, but they mean something completely different. And it's until people understand the context around it, like they can't do anything with it before that. Nobody cares about the number 5 is exactly what he says. And the challenge with all of these, I guess, stacked data sets is that there's actually a different data literacy that sits around each one of those sets of numbers. So if we talk about attendance in your context, there will be a data literacy that sits around that. You know, what are we aiming for? What are we considering to be good? What's concerning? You know, at what point are we actioning it? What's really low? You know, that whole data literacy that sits around attendance is completely different, say, to a quiz or percentage mark in a year 9 maths class. And the context that sits around those scores is completely different to a PM or probe reading level, which is completely different to a Pat Steinine, a NAPLAN band. You get the point. I could keep going. But every single data set that we're asking people to use, so if we're saying to teachers, these are the 10 key data sets, there are 10 sets of data literacy that they need to get a handle on. And that's why this is pretty challenging for teachers to be able to go, okay, well, I know how to use my data. This is what I'm going to do, because they haven't always actually been shown what that looks like or what the numbers mean. I often present to system leaders and to principals, and I've made a point of continuing. I started when I first started presenting, 4 years ago, I started kind of doing this part-time, and I used to talk about the difference between Pat Steinines and NAPLAN bands, and the difference between expected growth and what it looks like in one versus the other, and they're quite different. And it blows my mind how many like senior leaders come up to me afterwards and say, I'm so glad you explained that to me. I didn't know the difference. And I've kind of made a little pact, and I often say this when I share it with senior leaders. If one of you comes and says that to me at the end, thank you for explaining, then I'm going to continue talking about this. And I guess from my perspective, if senior leaders don't necessarily have that understanding, then it's fair to say that their middle leaders and their teachers probably don't have that understanding either. So we certainly need to build people's data literacy. We can't expect them to be using the numbers if they don't get it in the first place. The second one is visualizations. So there's kind of two parts to this. You might have in your school, so a lot of schools are going down the pathway of having a visualization dashboard. And what that visualization dashboard does is it reduces the cognitive load. It helps teachers interpret the data more easily. The trends are more easily identifiable. And there might be images in those visualizations, or there might be heat mapped tables of data. There might be line graphs, bar graphs, box and whisker plots, whatever they might be. In your visualization platform, your teachers need to know how to actually interpret or read the images that they're given, to read the visualizations. So that's part of the problem. It's, again, we can't assume that everybody knows how to read and interpret the information. We need to spend time with them on that to build that skill. But the other side of the visualization piece is that if you don't have a visualization dashboard in your school, you need to be able to build your own visualizations that actually help you see the trends. Or sometimes, or a lot of the times, visualization dashboards don't necessarily show you every single visualization that you would ever need. So you might need to go, even if you've got a great tech solution, you might still need to go and graph some information in a different way. The benefit of that is that it stops us sitting with a massive spreadsheet, trawling through all of these cells of numbers where we have to think about what each one means and what's happening on the left and right and above and below it. Visualizations really cut down that thinking time and that processing time. And as I said, it allows us to identify the trends more easily. What we're essentially trying to do with having people have a good understanding about the numbers and understanding the visuals that they're given, we need to kind of compress that time. So over time, we're trying to shorten that journey that it takes for people. Because both of those two things don't impact student achievement. They don't impact kids in classrooms. They don't impact a little person who's really struggling with writing. You can have beautiful visualizations, you can have great data literacy, but we need to set people up with that so that we can get to the data storytelling. So data storytelling is the most important part of this, but we can't get there without those other two pieces. In data storytelling, we kind of do two things. We think, what's the data actually telling me? So what are the insights? You know, what's standing out for me? What can I see from the data? And then the second part of data storytelling is, what am I doing in response to that? So I'll say that again. So it's, what's the data telling me? And then what am I doing in response? So regardless of your role in your school, those two questions are the same. So if you're a senior leader, you might be looking at your holistic attendance picture for the whole school. You might be looking at a breakdown of attendance by year level or by day of the week. And you might be looking for, what's the insights? What do I know? What's that data telling me? And then the second part is, what am I doing about that? You might be a middle leader, so a departmental head. You might be leading a teaching team in a year level. You might be leading middle years or senior years, whatever it might be. You're still asking those two questions when you get to storytelling. You're thinking, well, what's the data telling me about these kids, about my context, whatever it might be? And then it's, what am I doing in response, or how am I responding to that? And same with teachers. We're doing it at a different level. I guess we're actually looking probably a lot more fine grain at smaller data and looking more so maybe at criteria and individual student results. Same thing. What are the insights? What's the data telling me? How am I responding? So it's kind of different depths to the analysis that we're doing. And I guess the senior leaders in schools are looking at a really kind of holistic view. Think about kind of flying in a helicopter and you're flying over the top, and that's kind of the view that you're looking at, but you're still answering those two questions. Whereas kind of teachers in the classroom are looking at those really small data points that provide really specific information about what kids need. So one of the things I'd like to share with you is that I have a data diagnostic on my website, and the link is on my next page. So you're very welcome to go and do that at any stage. What it does is it gives you a score, a report in these three areas, and it compares your score, so your self-perception, what you've rated yourself, compared to all of the Australian teachers that have taken this. So in this data diagnostic, I've had about 2,500 people across the country do this. So I am kind of collecting data on the data. And there's some really interesting findings that I'm seeing in what teachers are telling me about building their skill. So the last set of questions that teachers are they're asked questions about their school. I'll just let you have a bit of a read of that. So there's 32 questions altogether. The data diagnostic, as I said, asked you questions in data literacy, visualization, and storytelling. And then the final section of the survey asks about schools specifically. So we're saying that we want to get teachers to the point of data storytelling. We want them being able to understand the data, to read their visualizations, and to think about, okay, well, what are the trends? What are the insights? What's the data telling me? And then how can I respond to that? The reason why I'm showing you these ones is because this is, I guess, the questions that relate to school structures and the things that potentially some of us in this Zoom room today can possibly do something about or do some thinking about. Obviously, the two there in red are the ones that jump out to me straight away. And interestingly, you know, the time theme came up a lot in the chat when I asked that question before. And it is consistently the lowest question across all 32 questions that I ask in my data diagnostic. So only, like, of all the results that could be given in terms of the maximum score, the amount of time people are provided has only scored 40% of all the available marks. Likewise, support for building these skills is pretty low as well. Yet the other part that I think is really interesting with this, the flip side of that, is question 26, which is that my school places a high emphasis on the use of data, and that's quite high. So that's, you know, it's 50% really higher than question 29. That's a significant gap between the expectations and the aspirations of leaders for teachers to be using data, and then the time and support that is provided to teachers along the way. So I'm saying teachers, but this survey has been done by a whole stack of different people from different levels of education. And the interesting thing that I've also noticed in this data is that senior leaders and principals, like, so senior leaders, system leaders, rate their skills, their perception of their skills is higher than middle leaders across the board. And the middle leaders' results are higher than teachers. So what I'm seeing in terms of the roles and in this survey across different schools is that some of the, I guess, the leaders, the people that are able to go to professional learning potentially and learn about using data, their skills are getting there. They're self-reporting relatively highly, saying, yep, I've got a pretty good handle on this. Their middle leaders are lower, and then their teachers are lower again. So it's almost kind of like this drip feeding that I can see in the data that I've collected from these 2,500 people, that the training and support that we're giving in schools is often hitting our senior leaders. It's not necessarily making its way down to teachers and therefore into classrooms. So the last little bit before we go to a Q&A this afternoon is I'd love to talk through, I guess, you know, I said I've been into a lot of different sites, a lot of different schools, and I've been really lucky to be able to, I guess, synthesize some of the learnings that I've seen and the things that work really well. And while there are certainly differences amongst sites, there are a lot of similarities. So successful schools in this space always articulate the why, and they don't do it once, they do it repeatedly. And for me, I hope that over the last 40 minutes or so, you can tell that the reason I love this is, for me, this is about kids, and it's making a difference for them. It's opening up pathways, it's helping them experience some success and some growth. And when schools can articulate that why to their staff and their staff get it, and their whole purpose around this conversation about data is about little people and what we can do for them just to help them that little bit more, just to be that little bit more targeted in our teaching, that's what successful schools are doing. You will never motivate people to use data through a compliance lens. So I've watched leaders say to staff, we have to do this because the system has asked us to, or the system has said we have to do this, let's just get it done, it'll be all over in an hour, like basically we'll just manage it. That's not motivating, it's not inspiring, and it doesn't then motivate or inspire those teachers to go out and look at data and use data positively in their classrooms. The other thing that I see successful schools doing is having structures where data use and conversations are authentically ingrained and incorporated into the structures that are already there. Teachers are incredibly time poor. We know the stress that teachers are under. We know how many teachers we are losing from our profession. So we cannot add the use of data as an extra on top of the things that we already do. Successful schools in this space are bringing the analysis and the discussion of data into things like the PLCs that they've already got, the action research projects that they already have in place, department meetings, staff meetings, whatever it might be. It's not an add-on, it's not an additional thing, it's embedded in all of those structures. Because for me, and again, what I see successful schools doing, you know, data is not separate to planning. It's not separate to those things. It's actually a really awesome tool that helps us plan and, you know, run research projects just that little bit better. So as much as we can kind of get that evidence and the data integrated into those structures, the better. One of those important structures that schools benefit from is a data plan. So a data plan for me is very different to a data schedule. So some schools have data schedules, which are useful. A schedule for me outlines what's being collected, when it's being collected, you know, maybe who's responsible for collecting it, maybe where the data is stored. But a data plan is different because it's actually a document that could be useful for a teacher. And it includes things like what's some of the analysis that they might undergo, how might they use the data, like what might they be looking for, and then what are some possible ways that that data might be used to help their practice. Because kind of going back to what I said about half an hour ago, there's plenty of people in our schools that don't actually know where to start with this. So the more we're able to structure and support and scaffold and build their skill over time and give them kind of those clues and support in the same way that we would for kids, the better they will get at actually knowing what to look for themselves without having to look at a data plan. So really good data plans have got some of that detail in it. And so it means that a teacher could pick up their little part and they could go, okay, these are the expectations around what I'm looking at, what I should be looking for, and how I could use it. The other thing that data plans benefit schools, or the other way they benefit schools, is that going through the process with leaders, when I've done it with them, or when I've kind of had people go away and write data plans and come back to me, I've had a lot of leaders say to me, I've really appreciated the chance just to think about, well, what actually matters. So it allows you to kind of go, what do we care about? What are those data sets that are important? What is valuable to us and why is it valuable? And then let's actually put that in a clear plan and outline some next steps for people. So yeah, both good for leaders and for teachers and everybody in the school. Obviously, you know, the two lowest points in those diagnostic results are around time and support, and successful schools in this space are prioritising the development of staff skill. This is an ongoing conversation. It's a long game. It's not something that, you know, one day wonder is going to come in and do a one-day PD and the data culture is going to have changed and everybody's skills will be magically better. If you're on this journey, you're on it for the long haul, and it has great potential to shape your school and improve outcomes for kids. But this is about frequent touch points for teachers to go back and practice. They won't remember if you go through, say, a platform with them one day, they won't in 3 months' time necessarily remember exactly how to get there and what you did with them last time. And it's just knowing that, and for that to be okay, but providing those opportunities and those kind of regular interactions with the tools, because it is new skills. So we certainly need to walk people through this process. Successful schools also have this, I guess, understanding, or really open about, we don't all have the answers. We all come with our own biases when we look at data. We all have a different understanding of the context that sits around them. We all see different things in the numbers. So actually, it's not about a senior leader telling somebody what to see in the data or what to do with it. It actually is a really open, collaborative conversation about, well, these are the things that I see, and these are some of the things that I reckon we might do in response to that. And, I've worked with principals who've literally come in and sat down at tables with teachers and gone, talk to me about your data. And they've asked questions like, I don't know what that means, or why do you reckon that happened, or what happened here in this little gap here. And the teachers and the leaders have had a really open and honest conversation about it. And that's just absolutely best practice. That's that third last one there, actually using the data. So really encouraging people to get to that point of storytelling where they're thinking, well, what does my data on my kids in my sphere of influence tell me? What am I doing to respond to that? It's, I can't kind of emphasize that enough. Some of the industry research says that from the point of collecting data through to acting on data, 80% of the time is taken up in collecting and prepping it and getting it ready. And we desperately need to, wherever we can, condense that 80% as much as possible, and then set up and embed structures that promote the storytelling. We don't want to have staff meetings where people are trawling through data, trying to get it to a point where they can use it, and then just not talk about how they're using it. We need to be prioritizing the storytelling. We talked about tracking progress and growth before. Schools are increasingly also tracking student wellbeing. So that's through regular, small, self-reported wellbeing surveys. And that's an awesome initiative, awesome tools out there on the market. And it's really good when it's used in conjunction with learning analytics, because we get that broader, more holistic picture of the young person. And the final one there, that you'll have wins, you'll take 2 steps forward, 1 step back on this journey. But schools that are successful are celebrating and recognizing the teachers that are doing this well or have little wins. And I often talk about a mate of mine, Heath, who was a teacher at a school I worked at when I was in a role of student data and performance. And I had my group of people who were in my data team, and I had a group of people that were really kind of numbers people. They loved it. Heath wasn't one of those people. He was a PE teacher. And he actually got up in front of the staff one day and showed people a tracking sheet and how he had been collecting data and how he'd been using it in his classroom and in conversation with parents. And him getting up and sharing that with staff converted so many more people to the data journey, and they could see it through his eyes. And I tell you, he got so many people on that journey, a lot faster than I had, and he got a lot of people that I hadn't been able to kind of access at that point. So the more we can celebrate it and recognize that, it isn't just a one size fits all approach for everybody. There are different things that work for different people at different times. The more we can kind of celebrate that, recognize that, and share that with staff, the better. So I'm going to pause there, and we're going to go to a bit of a Q&A. So I'm hoping, Lauren, you might be able to jump back on.
Hi, everyone.
Data. Yes, Anne, you know it.
Thank you, everyone, for sending in your terrific questions. We've just had another one come in just now. We might be pressed to get through all of them, but we will do our best. So we might start off with Leanne. What data visualization platforms have you found to be most effective in your practice, Selena?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's certainly platforms that you can build yourself. So some schools go down the path of investing in a Tableau or a Power BI solution, and that's can be really useful. Benefit of that is that you can build your own. You can custom build the visualizations. You can kind of do what you want. Downside is that's a lot of time and resources to get it up and running and get it built in the first place and have it maintained. There are other products on the market. So Track One provide like a learning management, a visualization dashboard. And there's stacks of different visualizations in there. Octopus BI is another one. They have some kind of custom made ones that you can choose and then you can build your own. So yeah, there's certainly a couple like that are out there. There's some learning management systems that do some visualizations, but the pure visualization dashboards, they're probably the main ones that I see most often.
Mm-hmm. And I think I remember in using and analysing data in Australian schools, you might have mentioned that you can even use the Google templates as well to be producing your own and tweaking them in that way. Is that connected?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, individual teachers. So there's actually plenty of schools where they don't have any visualization dashboards at all. And it literally is teachers using Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets and templates to produce their visualizations. So yeah, you know, if that's all you've got, they're still pretty good tools. They still work really well. And I use Excel most days of my life. So yeah, don't want to get rid of them just yet.
Love a spreadsheet. So Catherine has also asked, when collecting data on students who have learning difficulties for either a GAT or PAT tests, to best show growth in these students, should students be assigned tests on the same level each year or according to their cohort level? Is that a question that you can answer?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one because sometimes systems come in and say, well, they have to do the test, that's their year level. That's not hugely useful if they then do the test and they really struggle with it and they get a handful right. I did the PAT training a few years ago, and the lady that was running it said to me, she said, the goal is, you know, the goal is to get kids at about 50% right, because if a student gets everything right, you don't actually know how high they are. Or if they get almost everything wrong, you don't actually know how low they are. So in an ideal world, if you know the general level that they're working at, it's better data to actually assess them on the year level that they're working at, because then hopefully you can get about that 50-50 and you can work out where their strengths and their gaps are. And it gives you some really useful information. Mm-hmm. There's also in PAT, there's also adaptive testing, which has only really started in the last 12 months or so. And that's a better option because, like NAPLAN adaptive tests, it kind of pushes students through questions that are more suited to their ability. So it's based on how they went in the previous questions.
Great. And I think this question is about the data diagnostic results, that table that you showed a little bit earlier. This is from Luke. What kind of scale do you use for your report?
Yeah, so the scale is a 0 to 3. And so it's a perception survey, you know, like a 0 being not at all like me, through to 3 being, I can't remember the exact words, but, you know, essentially that you're doing that a lot of the time, or most of the time. Yeah.
Super. And this is from Jonathan. Do you think that the lack of time that people mentioned when we had that conversation in the chat, do you think the lack of time could be helped by more automation in data collection, analysis, and reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, hopefully the future is in AI and predictive analysis. And I think down the track, we will get a lot better at that, and our tech platforms will get better at it. I'm kind of really excited about the potential for it. What it doesn't do, you know, I don't think humans will ever replace, or AI will ever replace humans. We always need that human element in there. We always need people ultimately making the final decisions. But if AI is able to direct our attention to an area that was low, so at the moment, say, for example, if you log into the ACER platform, there's some really cool stuff in there, in the OARS platform, it can tell you which question was, you know, the lowest, the lowest percentage of students got it right. And that's really useful, but there's still a fair bit of thinking involved in, okay, so what does that mean? What are some possible activities? How could I possibly use it? There is a teacher resource page as well, where you can go and access that. If you've got paid access to it, you can go and look at it. But AI in a perfect world would be kind of saying, this student or this group is low in this area, this is the kind of activity that might benefit them, and almost doing some of that prediction for us, and almost alerting us. The other part of that is around flagging alerts. So I was with, you know, teachers are busy, right? We know that. So expecting people to log on to visualization dashboards and just check things out, that's not really likely to happen unless somebody really is a numbers person. They love the data. So the more we can start to get automations around, if a student's attendance falls below a certain percentage and the teacher gets an alert, the more we can do of that, the better, because then that's just not making people go and actively find the information. It's flagging it when it's actually something that they need to pay attention to.
Great. I might just throw this quick one in as well from Belinda. Can you provide any details of great wellbeing surveys for secondary students? And this might be something that people can talk about in the chat as well when we do move on to other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. If you use any wellbeing surveys, feel free to drop them in there. There's a few around. There's a lot of schools that are creating their own, and they're literally just collecting the data through Microsoft Forms or Google Forms, and they're connecting it to a visualization dashboard and visualizing it that way. There's some work around getting your questions right and keeping them consistent, all that sort of stuff, but that's just as valid. There's a lot of other tools that you could use. So there's an app called Connections that's for primary kids, and it looks at like the connections for kids in the classroom. We custom built one with Berry Street last year in Victoria around students on iPads, just selecting how they were feeling and how ready they feel to learn. Scodal is another one. Scodal's got some work, I think, in New Zealand now and even in the UK, and they've got a couple of questions. So there's a few around. Yeah, Ripple is another one. So there's, I guess, a difference between, there's some surveys that are annual. And I guess when I think about wellbeing data, I'm thinking about those smaller point in time, little kind of quick assessments that might happen 2 or 3 times a term. There are surveys that you might do once, maybe annually at the beginning of the year or whenever it might be, and you hold that data and you use it throughout the 12-month period. But yeah, there are some really good tools that allow you to collect really quick kind of data on their wellbeing.
Thank you. And thank you for Michael for jumping in there and throwing Ripple in too.
Yeah.
So we've also got another question. Do you have any data that support your statement, compliance doesn't motivate? And if there's any data to support or not using KPIs and system set improvement measures?
Yeah. So where did that compliance thing come from? It didn't come from education, and I can't remember off the top of my head where it came from. But yeah, outside of schools, that whole compliance is not a motivation strategy is pretty heavily written and like talked about. So you're very welcome to Google it. I will have a think about where I got that from. Sorry, what was the second part of that?
Similar line of thinking, is there any data to support or not using KPIs and system set improvement measures?
Yeah, so there's really mixed data on this, mixed research on it. There's some research that says that targets are useful because they, direct people towards a specific focus or target, and it can be useful to direct your attention. And there's also research that indicates that actually targets, when targets are put on things, it just opens themselves up to manipulation and to kind of, I guess there's also the negative connotation of holding people accountable and the pressure and the stress that puts people under. So there's kind of really mixed results around it. For me, it's the context and the data informed, not data driven piece, just I keep coming back to. I was coaching a leader in a small school recently, and their target from her system, so from her line manager, was to get 100% of students in the upper 2 bands in NAPLAN. And she had one student sitting NAPLAN that year because it was a really small school. And so she either was going to get the target or she wasn't. And so she was either going to get 100% or 0%. And so, being able to hold that context and just be a little bit more realistic and human about it alongside those targets, I think it's good because it can direct our attention to some things that we can work on. But yeah, not when it's data driven, as long as it's always being data informed.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be, oh, and Jonathan says, thanks. Thank you for taking so much time with those questions and answering them so thoughtfully. I do think we have covered most of the questions now. There were a couple of comments, so it was good to have some good discussion in the chat as well. There seems to be a general feeling of why aren't there more experts? Why aren't we really getting to take charge? And I guess that's an exciting possibility for all of us today is learning more and taking those back to classrooms and into meetings and whatnot, and being that change, I suppose. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you know, in every school that I've been into, there's somebody who really actually likes working with data. And so it's about tapping into the wisdom that you have on staff and thinking about ways that you can get them to share their practice, get them working with others, kind of get them having these conversations and really get those people on side, because yeah, there is so much wisdom out there already. It doesn't just require an external person. So yeah.
Terrific. I'm just going to share my screen again before we finish up, just because there was a request to see the books, and I did drop links to the books in the chat as well, so you can jump on there and have a look. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know it's not been easy taking time out of your busy day. We know you're wildly busy, and we're so grateful for you being here and for interacting so well and asking those terrific questions as well. That's been brilliant. And thank you, Selena, for taking the time to really pull those apart and being so generous in your responses as well. As I've mentioned, you can find Using and Analysing Data in Australian Schools and also Leading Data-Informed Change in Schools, and much more at hbe.com.au. And finally, a big thank you to Dr. Selena Fisk for joining us today and for sharing her insights with us. Thank you so much, Selena.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lauren. And yeah, thanks everybody. There's some really great questions and great engagement in the chat. So have a great rest of your week. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone.